Welcome to the Reset to Thrive channel, where we explore recovery from ME/CFS and long COVID. My name is Nicole Buffoni, and along with my co-host Jan Rothney, we'll be bringing you some real-life stories, the science and practical tips on how you can go from surviving to thriving. For our very first episode, I am super excited to welcome Jan Rothney. Jan Rothney is the founder and creator of the online program Reset to Thrive. She's also the author of Breaking Free. Both the program and the book have been instrumental in my own recovery. So I am so excited to be chatting to Jan today, and I hope you get as much out of this conversation as I did. First, I wanted to ask you, Jan, what was it that inspired you to write the book and set up a program? Yeah.
Oh, well, I had actually just retired. Um, so I had been a lecturer and a teacher, and I had run behavior centers, and then I'd gone into being a practitioner when I'd taken ill and had to give up my job. So I just literally retired when COVID hit. And, there were so many stories, the news was on 24/7. And I could just see that so many people with COVID were ending up the same way as people that had chronic fatigue syndrome or ME. And I could see that the whole language was really negative. And I remember just saying to my husband, all of these people are going to go down the same route, being told that they have to accept it. And there'll be research into medical models, and they need to know that they can get better. And that was the start of it. I just thought I was going to write a book years ago when I first recovered on my own. But of course, in those days, I needed an income because I had two youngsters and I was a single mum when I was recovering on my own. And then I took on a blended family. So life was just about being able to do work and provide. So retiring was an opportunity to write the book that I should have done for chronic fatigue syndrome, and then decided, no, I need to do it for chronic fatigue and for long COVID now. So that was it. I wrote the first edition in 7 weeks. And then it took me quite a lot longer to edit it because I'd written twice as much as the publishers could publish. But that was the trigger.
Yeah.
Recognizing that long COVID had so many similarities with chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you went through the journey yourself, what did you hear back from medical professionals or the general population in terms of like what messages were you getting when you first got sick?
Well, when I first got sick, I was literally bedridden and I knew nobody. There was no specialist chronic fatigue clinics in those days. And it was called ME in those days because, I first was bedridden when I was in my 40s. And I was literally on my own. So I saw very, very few people. And the only person I really saw or had phone calls from, my lovely GP used to phone me at home because I couldn't get to surgery often, was my GP. And he always said, even when I was feeling really despairing, he always said, Jan, you've been through the mill. Your body has had enough, but it will recover. And his words were really important because I knew myself when I was bedridden the first time, I was just on my own. So I only had my own experience to go by. And thank goodness I had lectured in health and social care. And I had run stress management programs and anger management programs and everything, when I ran behavior centers. And I knew that it was a stress response. I knew that the body had literally packed in because of chronic overload. And so the first time, I think I was very, very fortunate that I literally never spoke to any specialists. I never went to an AME group. I didn't even know there was one in those days. I did have one lady visit who had ME. She was the wife of a colleague, and I do mention this in the book because I was so shocked that she came to visit and she just reassured me that actually you will get used to this and your life will become very comfortable. And once you're not bedridden and you're able to do things, you'll be able to meet up with friends and have coffee, and you don't need to go back to work and blah blah blah. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. And she was the only person I ever saw. So I think having the GP the first time was absolutely instrumental, because I always assumed I would recover, because everything that I taught when I was a lecturer, it was the healing cycle. And you do recover quicker when you approach it in a certain way. And I understood that the body needed protecting at that time, and it would need time to heal. I did sleep a lot. I mean, a lot. I literally slept 24/7, I think, almost, for the first month or 6 weeks. And then I slept most of the time for months after that. So I do think restorative sleep is really important. And that's very different to just lying in bed worrying.
Yes.
So I had a lot of tools at my disposal, and I knew that my body's autonomic system had literally protected me. And I had my GP for the moments when I was feeling desperate. But the second time, when I had a relapse, was absolutely dire. And that's why I wrote part 2 of the book and did part 2 of the training program, because the second time they had set up clinics, specialist clinics, and I'm sure it may be different today, but they had specialist clinics where, of course, there'd been no clinics before, so nobody was an expert in chronic fatigue syndrome. They couldn't be, because it hadn't existed. It was the first time it was acknowledged as an unexplained medical condition. And they changed it from ME to chronic fatigue syndrome. So specialists came from all different areas. Some of them were immunologists, some of them were psychiatrists that headed up these centres. And then it was occupational therapists who were trained in the CBT approach to teach you how to accept, to change your thinking, to think that actually this is okay. We can learn to live with this. We can have a life. And that was their CBT approach of how do we approach things? How do we change what we're thinking about it? What do we actually physically do? Which was very, very minimal. And they they told me, I never saw my GP once. They told me, we cannot help you until you accept you will never recover. You will never fully recover because you've had a major relapse, and people who've had a major relapse do not recover. But they were also telling that to everybody in the group who had crashed for the first time, who'd been diagnosed for the first time. It wasn't just, I mean, obviously having a major relapse when I was bedridden again was quite profound, but even people that were being referred for the first time had to accept that this is not about recovery. And until I literally verbalized after my third one-to-one session, when I didn't want to submit, and then by my third one, I did submit. I caved in and I just said, I was so depressed. And I just said, I accept I will never recover. And the lady said, good, now we can start to give you some support. And I was like, oh my God. And I came out of there destroyed. And then I started to think, because they actually told me I was lucky. Because I kept saying, but I did recover the first time. I fully recovered. I was back to work doing everything, took on a blended family. And they said, well, you were very lucky. And I was like, was it just luck? It wasn't just lucky. And actually meeting people, that whole culture of, and I know they're doing it for best intention. I know they're doing it because if you have this thing and there's no way of getting rid of it, then, like multiple sclerosis or whatever it is, MND, we have to teach you how to live with it and how to manage it. And I thought, I completely understand that if I had MND.
Yeah.
But I haven't. I know that I can recover because I have recovered. I literally 100% fully recovered. I was out there living life to the absolute max, taking on, 4 additional children and running a behaviour centre and being the manager of a school. I did recover.
Yeah.
But because of people being around me the second time, who were constantly saying, you cannot recover, unlike my GP the first time, and because I was devastated by having a relapse, I then completely lost my way. Not completely, I still was boom and busting and ecstatic when I was well, and, really positive and doing everything rather than, I never paced myself or anything. But every time I had a setback, which would be very, very often, I went into complete devastation mode.
Yeah.
And I started to believe what they'd said. In fact, it didn't take very long. You become disempowered very quickly.
Yes.
I started to think, well, maybe they are right. Maybe I was just lucky the first time. Maybe I have to accept this. And then I couldn't get out of the setbacks as easily because I was so disempowered, because I was so helpless, because there was emotional turmoil going on, which was obviously triggering the survival system
Yes.
because I was in such a bad place.
Yeah.
And I think that was a real, real turning point for me. And that's a big part of why I wrote the book, because it does matter having the people around you of, I talk about what you focus on. I would say to everybody, everybody's entitled to their belief, and that's absolutely fine. And I think most people are coming from best intention, absolutely. And it's just what they know, it's what they've been trained in. But you have to choose what is useful for you. And what is so much more useful is to focus on the people that can recover, the people that have recovered. Listen to the people that say you can recover. I mean, my doctor was wonderful. And when he found out what I'd been told months and months later, just by chance, I went for something else, not because of chronic fatigue. He couldn't believe it. He could not believe that professionals were telling me that. And I said, it's not just one, it's every single one is saying it. And the occupational health doctor who signed me off work.
Yeah.
Even when I fully recovered, he signed me off work because it's written in my notes that I will always have relapses because you cannot get rid of ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. That was what was written in my notes, even when I'd fully recovered from the relapse.
So when you were in that
That's scary.
horrible place and and those horrible thoughts were being reinforced by professionals, how did you turn it around? Like, how did you get out of that?
So I'm very fortunate that I had recovered before. So I had to get my focus, even in the desperate times, I had to get my focus on you did do it before, you can do it again. I didn't permanently think, well, maybe I was just lucky. I did have to grab onto that little gem that was, but you have recovered. You can recover. And actually, I was married then, and my husband kept saying, you just need to rest. You just need to rest and you'll get better. So that was helpful. And then I found a practitioner who reminded me that you can recover. And I just needed that one day to think, oh my God, you know, you've started to go down that track because you're so started to listen to beliefs that are not useful and opinions that are not useful. And look what effect it has on me. And you just got to get back to what you did the first time.
Yeah.
And honestly, I can't imagine how awful it must be for people that have never had a background in health and social care, who've never taught about the autonomic system and the impact of the Pavlovian response, the conditioned response on the body and predictive error, because I was psychology. I taught all this stuff. So I knew what to do and what not to do, and I
Yeah.
had to get on track.
Yeah.
Um, so I would say to anybody who, isn't fortunate enough to have that background, focus and search for all the people that have recovered, listen to the stories of how they recovered, find out information of recovery, because it is possible. So many people do recover. I think 25% of people recover spontaneously. There's just huge numbers of people. When you look at different stories now, and you can find them on YouTube, you find it in my book, on the program, you find it on, Raylan. There are so many people, and that's what the focus needs to be.
Yeah.
That's what can establish healthy beliefs that enable you to respond to things in a way that will promote healing instead of sabotage your healing.
For people that are new to this sort of way of thinking about chronic fatigue, you talk a lot about the nervous system, and I know you've talked about cell danger response. What sort of things do you think are really important fundamentals for people to understand who maybe have just started, they've just got a diagnosis and maybe they're being told by their doctor, you know, recovery's rare and we don't have any treatment, or, they're not being given a clear pathway. What would you say to them first about the science? Like what science helped you recover?
Yeah. So I think to make it very simple for people, essentially, the brain and the body are in unison. They're forever working together in a partnership. And I talk very much about the brain rather than the mind, because the mind implies you're doing something consciously and thinking about it, but
Yeah.
it's not. 80% of every reaction we have is an automatic response. And if you think that the brain is controlling the body, obviously, if you cut your head off, it's not a lot your body's going to do, your heart and your immune system and your gut and all the rest of it isn't going to work very well. So your brain is literally the master controlling every response that we have. And it is permanently checking out that you're safe. That's the whole point. I start the book with Thrive and Survive because we forget we are just part of nature. We're the same as everything else in nature. Everything in nature predominantly is here to survive. First of all, you've got to survive, you've got to be safe, not get eaten. And then you can start to do all the nice stuff, do your theatre, write books, do whatever you want to do, if we're fortunate. But the predominant thing about nature is survival. That is the bottom line. So our brains are programmed to be weighted towards survival. It's always looking out for your survival, always checking that you are safe. And there are 40 times more neural pathways going to our survival protective system than there are to turn it off, which is why it's so easy for it to switch on. And I think if you just think, what message is my brain getting? For it to then adapt the body accordingly. And that's in the book. I talk a lot about adapting.
Mm.
And it is our autonomic nervous system that adapts the body, switches the body into the appropriate mode for whatever the brain is detecting is going on for us.
Yeah.
And that can be external or internal. So when I was first recovering, for instance, my first memory of being out of bed doesn't necessarily, it was the first because so much brain fog, but my first memory is crawling across my bedroom floor to get to the toilet that was just next door. And I was ecstatic. I was so ecstatic that I'd managed to get out of bed for the first time. And I had to crawl back. In fact, I remember lots of times actually crawling and falling asleep on the floor. But that was, to go back to the brain and the body, what is going on? What is it picking up? Because I was recognizing that, seeing that as a fabulous event, that I can move. I can remember lifting my head up on the pillow. I can actually remember the first time that I remember opening my eyes and having my eyes and lying in my bed awake and thinking, oh my God, I've come round. And thinking, oh my God, that's amazing. I'm getting better. It was only years later when I spoke to other people and they had been terrified of those events, of lying awake in bed, of crawling across the floor. So what I would say to anybody in terms of the science is it's the feedback loop, the neurological feedback loop.
Yes.
So I got myself into a positive neurological feedback loop. Neurological is just the brain and what the brain is connecting. It's literally making loads of connections to every single second that you're alive. And for me, it was making really positive connections that actually this is progress, that's okay, I'm safe, I'm good, I'm on it.
Yes.
Even when I then was back in bed for days on end, I had evidence that my body's doing something better.
Yeah.
And I clung on to that for dear life. Every single, I call it the green shoots of recovery in the book, because you're always wanting to have this, no matter what the event, this feedback that is saying, do you know what? I'm okay. Thank you for protecting me. I needed protecting. I needed shutting down because I would not listen.
Yeah.
You know, thank goodness in a way, you know, I could have ended up with a stroke or a heart attack or anything, who knows? But because we're so mentally strong, so many people with chronic fatigue are so mentally strong, they just keep going, even though you have so many signs. I had 10 years of different illnesses before I completely packed in. So I'd always say, actually learn gratitude, because the science of gratitude is that you're doing the positive neurological feedback.
Yes.
And then the body is going to be put into the calm parasympathetic that enables your healthy vagal system to make your organs work and feed your organs. The immune system, your gut, your heart, your breathing, the skin. Skin was a big thing for me. So I would say to anybody, really get your focus. Really look for those little green shoots. Imagine that your brain and your body are talking to each other constantly. And you're feeding back with your facial expression, your tone of voice, your gestures, that actually this is okay.
Yeah.
And then the brain's getting the message. And so it's constantly adapting the body to start to heal again. And you mentioned the cell danger
Danger
response, cell
response. Yeah.
response, Navier, that's in the book. And referred to on the program, we talk about on the program. And the language again is the cycle. You know, we have got trapped in the sickness cycle, and all chronic conditions. They think that over 90% of chronic conditions is getting stuck in the sickness cycle, where the sickness behavior just carry on, carry on, carry on. You feel like you've still got the flu, you get the temperature, you get your glands swelling up, you know, it's like, oh my God. And that's because we're getting stuck in the negative neurological feedback loop.
Yeah.
And the brain is not sending out the message that it is safe to heal, right down to the cellular level. You know, Navier is a cellular biologist, and so many people are doing this research now. I don't know if you know coffee, but coffee is the consortium of chronic fatigue investigation. And they're doing really fabulous research at the cellular level, at the physiological level, at the neurological level, to show how all of this is impacting.
Mm.
of the condition. And the thing that really struck me is for the healing cycle to complete. So our healing cycle sort of starts and stops and starts and stops, and you get setbacks and setbacks. For it to complete, you have to be living in the vagal system. It can only complete its cycle when we are in that calm parasympathetic, when we are feeding back, actually, I'm safe, this is okay. And when it eventually gets the message, the healing cycle says, okay, I'll carry on then.
Yes.
Off you go.
Which is
So
why pushing through doesn't work, because that's
absolutely,
I went back and looked at some a journal that I'd written. I'd started somebody else's program before I did Reset to Thrive, Jan, and I had to write why I wanted to get better. And I recently reread this letter, and it was all about how my son's life is going to be terrible if I don't get better, and I have to get better. And I read it now after doing your program. I'm like, there's so much
yeah,
fear and pressure, and I was just feeding that negative
absolutely,
loop that you were talking about. Yeah.
absolutely. And nobody, it's normal, isn't it?
Mm,
That's your natural reaction. Of course, your natural reaction is to be terrified. And then, as you say, it's not just the illness in itself is devastating because you are so debilitated. But then it's all the consequences of being ill.
yeah.
I'm going to lose our home.
Yeah.
I can't pay the mortgage. The children are going to have no mom to look after them. It's absolutely devastating. And I'm not negating that. That
Yes.
is 100% true. And in the relapse, I really struggled with that. I mean, twice we were going to lose the mortgage, both times, lose the house. So I'm not negating that all of this is terrifying, but it's about having to shelve all of that because actually that is not going to help my recovery.
Yeah.
Thinking about all these things literally does get us stuck
Yeah.
because it's so stressful and it fires off the stress response system that is creating the symptoms in the first place. But it's that ability to just shelve it and focus on what do I need to do to get better.
Yeah.
And I know it's a big ask, which is why I think having support groups and having the community chats, that's why I set up the Reset to Thrive,
Yeah.
because I knew that a lot of people would really find it difficult to recover on their own.
Yeah.
Even though they have the book, they have the guide, they have this, it is incredibly hard to recover on your own. I was very fortunate that I'd lectured in this.
Yeah.
I taught psychology since I was a young woman, and I taught health and social care. So, I had a real advantage.
Yeah.
And that's literally why I set up the training program, because I thought, people need to have a demonstration, they need to have videos, they need to see somebody doing it. Then I realized that isn't enough. Actually, what they need is other people. So then along comes lovely Nikki. Um, and I think actually, and we know from all the research, and that's in the book, and I'll update it in the next version, that the key to recovery is support networks. The
Yeah.
key to well-being is having the support network.
Yeah.
And so for anybody listening, you know, I would say do reach out
Yeah.
and find a community. I think the community on the Reset to Thrive is amazing
Mm.
because they're so supportive of each other. You know, when they join the community breakout rooms, or they join the peer group support, or come to the webinars and do courses. I just think it is very, very special.
Yeah.
And you know this from doing the survey with the peer group support, how much people acknowledge that having someone to guide them through and to talk about it and to be able to learn from each other is such a valuable
And
asset.
sharing those little wins, I think, is
Absolutely.
important because as someone who's lived through it, you know what it's like. Other people probably don't understand us celebrating about having a cup of tea or
I know. I know. That's so funny because I remember when I recovered on my own, of course, my two children lived at home. And I spent a lot of time being nocturnal after I'd been bedridden. I was awake all night and asleep all day. And then eventually it became settled and I was awake in the daytime. And I remember going for a walk around the block, which was tiny, just to walk around my block. And I came in the door, and my daughter and her boyfriend, her little friend at the time, were going out the door. And I just said, I just walked around the block. And they're like, well done, Mum. Because literally nobody gets it
no.
unless you have had it.
Yeah.
And often, even your nearest and dearest do not, they can't.
Yeah.
They haven't walked in your shoes. They can't get it.
Yeah. Well, we might leave it there for today. Thank you so much, Jan, for all those wonderful tips. And if you enjoyed today's video, please make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can get updates on the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.